And namaste, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Brinda Kotak, and over the next 2 days, I, along with my friend Gayatri here, hope to take you through a scriptural and cultural view of menstruation with a focus on debunking several myths and misconceptions that exist around this topic, especially concerning the Hindu view. Now, just to give you a little bit of background about myself and how this whole thing came about. I grew up in an urban city in India. And growing up, I had constantly been inundated with very loaded statements like Hinduism is misogynistic or Hinduism considers women impure because they menstruate. And not only in India, unfortunately, I found that these same misconceptions were also perpetuated in American society about Indian culture. So I did my bachelor's and master's from the University of Pennsylvania and Carnegie Mellon University, respectively. And on both these campuses, I found them echoing very similar viewpoints that were laden with untruths and misconceptions about Hindu shastras and Hindu culture. So as a practicing Hindu, I knew that these were misconceptions and not true. However, as we did more research and looked a little deeper into the topic, I found that these claims were just categorically untrue. And in fact, a lot of the concepts of the Shastras were in direct opposition to what was being propagated as fact. So today, I hope to take you through some of the findings that Gayatri and I have come across. So, Gayatri, over to you.
So, my name is Gayatri, and my view on menstruation is a little different, having been born and brought up in the United States. So, in the West, Eastern traditions and Eastern customs are often put under the umbrella as regressive or oppressive, and menstruation is one of the hotly debated topics. So, as a practicing Hindu, I wanted to understand what these norms were by reading my own scriptures and coming to a clear understanding myself. So we hope to share some of this knowledge with you, and we hope you find this webinar informative and impactful. And just for some housekeeping, we'd like to request everyone to please mute themselves. And if you have any questions, we've blocked out the last 10 to 15 minutes for question and answer, but you can also put them up on the chat box and we'll take them as we go, or we'll take them at the end. So without further ado, let's get straight into the material. So what will we study? Well, throughout the course of this webinar, we will first talk about the Hindu view of menstruation and what it has to say. And then on day 2, we will be discussing everything else, such as the other Indic faiths, what early civilizations, such as the Greeks, the Romans, and the Mesopotamians and Egyptians had to say about menstruation and their cultural practices. Then we'll discuss the Abrahamic faiths, and this will set us up nicely to talk about contemporary culture and the current view of menstruation in society. So now let's get straight into the Hindu view, and in this section, we will be debunking some of the common myths and misconceptions about what Hinduism recommends and what Hinduism teaches.
Now, menstruation appears in Hindu Shastras a lot. It is discussed in great detail on several different levels and in several different contexts. It is talked about in terms of health and wellness in yoga and Ayurveda. It is talked about in terms of cosmic energy and forces in Jyotish Shastras. And it is talked about on a more physiological level in texts such as the Kama Sutra. And in all other Shastras, menstruation is talked about in terms of spirituality and dharma. So, right away, this myth about menstruation being taboo and somehow hush hush and thrown under the rug under Hinduism is simply not true and debunked immediately. But this is not the central conflict around menstruation. The central conflict around menstruation, which is the base of a lot of the charges leveled against Hindu Shastras, comes from this apparent paradox that exists. Now, the charge that is leveled against Hinduism is that, on one hand, Hinduism considers women to be embodiments of Shakti. There is inherent divinity associated with femininity and the feminine form in general. On the other hand, though, people claim that Hinduism sees menstruation as impure, and therefore, by connection, all of womankind as impure. This is simply not true, and this misconception arises from this very unfortunate word that has been mistranslated and misused, called, the word is ashaucha. Now, Hindi speakers in the audience will immediately know what a shaucha means. We use it quite often, and in fact, our bathrooms are called shauchalayas. So we know that the translation of ashaucha is not really impure the way some Western Indologists have portrayed it to be, but rather the closer translation is actually unclean. But also, the word ashaucha is used in the context of menstruation. However, it is only used to describe menstrual blood that has been discarded. It does not refer to the process of menstruation. It does not refer to the person who is menstruating, and it certainly does not refer to all of womankind in general. Just to give you another example, the word ashaucha is also used to describe several other bodily excreta like urine, feces, and even sweat. So, saying that anyone who menstruates is impure is the equivalent of saying that anybody who sweats is impure, simply because sweat is considered a waste product and is therefore a shaucha. So clearly this misconception about menstruation being impure is just not true. In fact, as we'll see as we go along in this presentation, that there are several other more holy and more pious aspects associated with the process of menstruation that have nothing to do with ashaucha at all.
So, to understand the problem with using the term ashocha, it's really important to understand that Western psychology and science differ greatly from Eastern psychology and science, and more specifically, Hindu and the Vedic psychology and sciences. For example, the most prominent difference is that in the Western view, humans are just physical individuals with a physical brain. The idea of the mind and the consciousness are used interchangeably. However, in the Hindu or Vedic view, individuals have 5 specific layers of individuality that are all integrated with each other. The mind and the consciousness are completely different, but they're integrated at a physical level. So, as the Western view limits us in 2 levels, a bodily and a mental, the Hindu, with its 5 layers of individuality, has a 3-pronged approach: a body, mind, and consciousness model. So, what exactly are these 5 layers? These 5 layers are known as the panchakoshas. So at the very bottom or physical level, you have your annamaya kosha, and then you have your vital level, your pranamaya kosha, which is your life air, and then you have the mental layer that controls your thoughts, the manomaya kosha, and that is separate from the intellectual level, your vijnanamaya kosha. On top of everything is your state of pure bliss and spirituality, anandamaya kosha. It's also really important to understand that these are concentric circles. For example, being at the state of bliss means that you have the other 4, and being at an intellectual level means you already have the below 3, and so on.
Now, out of these 5 koshas, there are 3 vyavaharik koshas. These are the base koshas. So, this is your annamaya or your physical kosha, your vital or your pranamaya kosha, and your mental or your manomaya kosha. Now, these are called vyavaharik koshas because these are the koshas that are most prominent with all of us in our day to day activities. So, in context of shastras and menstruation, it is very clearly mentioned that menstruation applies only to these 3 vyavaharik koshas. Menstruation has no effect on your Vijnanmaya kosha, so it has no effect on your intellectual capacities and capabilities, and it has no effect on your Anandmaya kosha, so it has no effect on your dharmic identity or spiritual identity or any spiritual endeavor. Now, we saw that the word ashaucha has been so badly misused and it's being used to denote a negativity towards all of womankind in general. But that is simply not true. Even though the blood of that is being discarded during the process of menstruation is considered ashaucha, that ashaucha is very temporary and is limited to only the annamaya level. All your other koshas are not influenced in a negative way at all. And also another perspective that the Shastras give is that because the menstrual blood can be considered a shaucha, it is meant to be discarded. It is supposed to be discarded because the feminine form and people in general are inherently pure. And to maintain that purity, the same way we discard urine, feces, and other toxins through sweat, that same process applies to menstrual blood as well in terms of its excretion.
So, what's the takeaway here? The takeaway here is just that physical impurity out of a bodily level is not equivalent to an impure individual. Menstruation is not an impure act. Menstruating women are not impure. The Vedas were actually quite progressive in that they understood this and they were written with the respect to the five layers. So, therefore, when you cherry pick and pull things out of context and say obnoxious things like menstruation makes women impure, it's just extremely irresponsible and factually incorrect. So now that we've discussed what menstruation isn't, it isn't an impure process. Let's talk about what it is. So what exactly is menstruation? So Hinduism breaks down the process of menstruation into three different aspects. First, it talks about menstruation as a period of purification. Then it discusses menstruation as a time of austerity. And lastly, it goes really deep into giving the idea of women rest. Let's take a closer look at menstruation as self-purification.
So we already talked about how menstruation affects you only on three of the five koshas, or the Vyavaharik koshas, or the Annamaya kosh, Pranamaya kosh, and Manomaya kosh. So in all of these three koshas, the way that menstruation works is that it works as an agent of purification, or almost an accelerator of purification. And how does it happen? On the physical level or the Annamaya level, it is very obvious that it is removing your unused endocrine lining, cervical mucus, and other vaginal secretions. So it's already getting rid of physical waste. At a vital level or at a pranamaya level, it removes apanavayu or excess vayu. Apanavayu is linked with several disorders of the mind as well, and uncomfortable natures of the mind, including maybe fear and anger. And those are removed when apanavayu is balanced, and apanavayu is balanced through the process of menstruation. And third, at the mental level or the manomaya level, it removes mental impurities. What mental impurities basically refer to negative emotions or emotions that give you yourself trouble, like anger, frustration, greed, all of these. All of these are reduced in intensity and they are reduced in their power through the process of menstruation. So clearly here there is a very positive effect that menstruation has. This is the complete opposite of this so-called ashaucha effect that people claim. But here you can see that the Shastras clearly say how menstruation has such a positive and purifying effect on the three koshas that it deals with.
So let's take a closer look at purification on a pranamaya level. So a pranamaya level is the level of life air. The Vasishtha Dharma Sutra talks about two presiding deities, Agni and Soma, who take care of women. Agni is associated with life air, and Soma is the name of the moon, which has many links to menstruation. Actually, a fun fact is that Lord Shiva's Tandava dance has lots of ties to menstruation. The 28 syllables he says represent the 28 days of the menstrual cycle. So the sloka here talks about how women are always free from stains and cannot be contaminated because Agni and Soma grant them three things. One, cleanliness. Two, a melodious voice. And third, purity of all limbs. Now let's look at manomaya purification. So at a mental level, menstruation actually purifies a woman from any actions wrongly committed onto her, such as sexual assault or rape. The idea behind this is basically that when something dishonorable happens to a woman, a lot of the time she self-internalizes this guilt, and menstruation is just the physical process of removing those mental burdens. Some qualified commentators even go as far as to say this goes beyond sexual assault and rape. It can just be any sort of negativity in their life. Furthermore, in the Manusmriti, it is said that the mouth of a woman is always pure. But why is that? We often hear this line that whatever a woman says will come true, the mouth of a woman is always pure. But what's really important to know is people take this out of context. The only reason why whatever a woman says is pure is because menstruation cleanses her of all impurities. The reason her thoughts are always pure is because they are purified through menstruation. This goes to show us how dangerous cherry picking and not understanding the context of our Hindu scriptures can be. So, how exactly are these thoughts purified through menstruation?
So, the second way that menstruation is talked about in the Shastras is that as a period of austerity. Now, austerity, when we translate it into Sanskrit, translates to tapas or tapasya, which I'm sure if a lot of us would have already heard. But tapasya in general is used to describe an austerity or a hardship that is voluntarily undertaken in order to further your connection with God, in order to accomplish some other spiritual goal, or to develop and grow in your own dharma pursuits. Now, this is one of my favorite ways of looking at menstruation from the Shastras, because this is really where the sensitivity of the Shastras come out. The Shastras acknowledge the hardships associated with menstruation and the struggle that comes along with them. And in recognition of these hardships and the struggle, menstruation itself is considered a tapasya. The process of menstruation itself is tapasya, itself is an austerity. And in the context of menstruation itself, the tapasya here is that it helps us get rid of vikarmas. Now, vikarmas refer to negative actions or actions with negative consequences, and these vikarmas are neutralized when women menstruate. Another charge that is often leveled at Hinduism is that there seem to be a lot more rituals and goals anointed for men as compared to women. And here's why. The Dharma Sutras explain that what comes by special efforts to men comes as natural process to women. Through the process of menstruation, women have the natural facility of neutralizing or getting rid of their vikarmas. Since this is not available to men, they have to make that excess endeavor and they have to perform those extra rituals in order to achieve that same neutralization of vikarma that women already naturally do. In terms of the purity of women, again, the Vashishta Dharma Sutras compare the limbs of a woman to the feet of a Brahmana and the back or the hump of a cow, both of which we know are considered very holy in Hindu theology and ideology and are really revered by practicing Hindus.
So, now let's go through the final notion of Hinduism regarding menstruation. Menstruation as a time of rest. So, we know from science and modern knowledge that women face a lot of discomfort during menstruation, sometimes as serious as endometriosis, PCOS. So, there are many scriptural precedents that talk about taking rest. The notion of taking rest is actually well recognized in Hindu scriptures, and it is unique to Hinduism. And as a result, there are so many traditional practices that are linked to communities just trying to promote the idea of removing a woman from a working environment where there's physical exertion or an environment to ease her physical pain. So, what does science tell us about menstruation? The idea that menstruation is critical for women's health is completely recognized. Having regular periods is really important for your physical and mental health, and even weight loss and weight gain have so much to do with your menstrual cycle. There are so many benefits of getting your period. This is not debated upon in the medical community. And in fact, yoga and Ayurveda were not opposed to this at all. So, what is the yogic and Ayurvedic perspective on women's health? There are specific books in Ayurveda focused on women's health, and many of these books give healthy menstruation and regular cycles the utmost importance. So, right off the bat, we can see that the entire myth of painful period cycles are a result of your bad karma is just thrown out the window. How can this be true if Ayurveda literally has treatments for painful periods? There are so many unique treatments based on your doshas, your Vata Pitta Kapha profile, out of which the Rajaswala Parichaya is the most common and has a high success rate. So, what are the scriptural precedents of taking rest? We see that it is advised for women to resume work only after their monthly periods stop, which implies that they are not recommended to be working during their monthly cycle. Furthermore, in the Vasishtha Dharma Sutra, we see that a menstruating woman does not need to participate in physical exertion of any kind. Again, the entire notion behind this, it's not prohibitory. These are just recommendations to give you some comfort. So if doing an action will cause you pain, don't do it. That's just what the scriptures are telling us. Very qualified commentators of the Vedas have even gone as far as to say that fathers who force their daughters to work during their periods or harass them negatively, impact their emotions, are comparable to animals.
So, what exactly are the rules of Hinduism? Now, we saw the philosophy behind the Hindu shastras and their views on menstruation. We saw them looking at menstruation as a tapasya, we saw them looking at menstruation as a period of rest, and we saw them looking at menstruation as a way to get rid of impurities. No, now this translates into specific guidelines and specific advice that the shastras give women. So let's go into that. And they're briefly just a set of do's and don'ts. Let's start with the don'ts first. It shouldn't surprise us to know that the don'ts have to do mainly with rest. And the idea here is to create a peaceful environment that gives women a break from daily life. So, the general uniting principle with all of these don'ts is that, whatever is keeping you busy on a day-to-day basis, whether it's working, whether it's cooking, whether it's cleaning, whatever that may be, just don't do it. And if you can see, and that, a controversy that is almost always brought up is that women are not allowed to worship, or they're not allowed in certain temples while they're menstruating. However, this does not apply to the confines of a home. So a temple is an individual institution that is following shastric rules and shastric traditions over several generations, right? And as people, we can respect the rules of that institution, but it is important to mention that it is not strictly prohibited in the shastras. This is simply local tradition and traditions of the temple. This is not coming directly from the shastras. Now let's go to what the shastras recommend women to do. And in the same vein as the don'ts of the shastras, the do's of the shastras revolve around making sure that women are comfortable and that she has everything that she needs, including space, privacy, access to good food, water, a bathroom, shower, a clean bed, and even wholesome literature. But most importantly, rest. Now, another important thing to consider when we talk about the do's of Hinduism is that what happens if you don't follow these? Or, what happens if these rules get broken? The short answer to that is nothing. This doesn't fall under the category of papa or some cardinal sin that has been committed. The only consequences that the Shastras talk about of non following of these rules is that a woman may not get the adequate amount of rest that she needs, and she may have a harder menstrual cycle than she needs to. So, this is not a case of women being shunned from dharma. In fact, if you take a look at something that is encouraged for women to do during menstruation, it is, if we can go back to the do slide, something that is encouraged for women to do is reading stotras and inspiring literature. So it is not that suddenly your connection to God gets severed. If at all, it only changes its form. So if in one, instead of going to a temple physically, you are maybe doing other forms of connecting to God, including mantras, japas, or even reading literature. So now, these do's and don'ts, these are straight from the Shastras. But of course, these have been taken on by society. They have been interpreted by different societies and different local traditions in their own way. And one such way that they have interpreted this is the concept of a chopadi. Now, a chopadi, literally translated, means a separate room or a separate place. And this chopadi specifically refers to a separate room or place for menstruating women. Now, if you can see, the picture on the far right is a picture of a Rajput chopadi that is very recent. So, this is still active, and this was how chaupadis were meant to be designed or were designed for a long time. And as you can see, it is clearly adhering to what the shastras say as well, in terms of there's a clean bed, there's access to books, and the overall environment is peaceful, and the woman basically has everything that she needs to maintain 3 or 4 days of good rest and good tapasya. The illustration in the middle of the slide is an illustration done somewhere between the 13th and 14th centuries of what activity in a chopadi normally looked like. And you can see that there are women talking, lying around, have taking their rest and reading books, and there is even a child present there. So clearly, this is not meant to be a jail cell. It's not meant to, shun women or remove them from society, but rather it is meant to be a positive communal space where women can get, that women who are sharing their menstrual cycles can rest together. Now, unfortunately, this chopadi has also seen some very negative consequences. So the picture on the extreme left that you see is also a chopadi from Nepal, and this chopadi is clearly not a good condition for women to rest in. This is not based on the shastras at all. So you see, over time, unfortunately, things like this can happen, that the actual word of the shastras gets denigrated and destroyed over time, and then almost misused. So as you can see, these chaupadis were traditionally only built for royal families or rich merchant families who could afford to build such facilities. Maybe in smaller families, there was a separate room assigned or just a separate space. But when these kind of traditions are taken to the extreme, it leads to a lot of violence. And it is important to mention in the context of chopadi that also, although we saw this really rundown chopadi in Nepal, that there are several other villages in India, in especially Maharashtra and Gujarat, that still have this practice of chopadi. And the chopadi homes are some of the most beautiful and some of the cleanest homes of the entire village. So it's not necessary that all there is always degradation happening and that this degradation has happened everywhere. But of course, to several communities like the one you saw in Nepal, either because of the non-educatedness of the shastras, or just a misunderstanding of the traditions, uh, somehow a degradation could have happened. But there has also been a lot of positive ways in which society has taken the menstruation guidelines or rules, or even just the philosophy of menstruation from the shastras. So let's take a look at some of the celebrations of menstruation in Hinduism, starting with Assam, just outside of Guwahati, with the Kamakhya Devi temple. Kamakya Devi is the menstruating goddess. That is the most accurate way to describe her. In fact, the main deity of the temple is a yoni. It's the vulva of Kamakya Devi herself, or another way to look at it is actual female genitalia. And one of the specialities of this Devi is that she menstruates every year for 3 days. Keeping in line with the Shastras, for these 3 days, uh, the doors are shut. She's given her space and her privacy, but also a lot of food, water, and several cloths and other nice clothes that she can wear, and cloths that she can use for her menstrual blood. At the end of 3 days, the doors are open, and the cloth that is meant to be Kamakya Devi's menstrual cloth, that is by now blood soaked and dark red, that cloth is considered the Devi's Mahaprasad. This is a fascinating concept in the Kamakhya Devi temple. Can you imagine that menstrual blood that is that has soaked menstrual cloth, and that cloth actually has a waiting list of devotees to get access to, because the Mahaprasad of the Devi herself is nothing but the menstrual blood. So this is completely against this entire misconception of, again, blood being impure and all of those. Even though menstrual blood is considered a shaucha in some places in the shastras, here we see that Kamakhya Devi's menstrual blood is considered Mahaprasad. So this just goes to show how there is divinity in every aspect of femininity. And even a shaucha menstrual blood can be seen as the most divine and can be taken as Mahaprasad from Kamakhya Devi. Even the feminine form. We mentioned this earlier, this is just practical proof. Now, close by, towards the east coast of India, in Orissa and some parts of Jharkhand, they perform this festival called Raja Parva. And so the predominant deity in Orissa is Jagannath Ji, and Jagannath Ji's consort is Bhumi Devi, or Mother Earth. And every year, again, similar principle, for 3 days Bhumi Devi herself menstruates. And the way people celebrate it is very sweet. No agricultural practices happen for those 3 days, because again, the principle of giving Bhumi Devi rest. But also, it they take the idea is people makes big swings and decorate them with leaves and flowers and all of these other adornments that Bhumi Devi provides for us, as a show of gratitude to Bhudevi and as an offering to Bhudevi. There are special songs, there are special dances, and there are special pujas that are done during these 3 days, and men are very active participants. So again, this is a this is still practiced to this day, and there are many there are many cultural practices as well associated with Raja Parva. So clearly, menstruation is not, is not a taboo, or is not looked down upon. And if we consider Bhudevi herself to be menstruating, and it is definitely not something that is impure at all.
So now let's take a look at it down south in Karnataka. So a similar festival to Raja Parva is Kedasa, when Bhudevi menstruates in the south. So it's celebrated in the villages, and it is said that during the menses of the earth, women just don't do any work. They just play and they sing with their friends. And as we can see, this is not a time of mourning or impurity or shame or sin. It's a celebration. And understanding that Bhudevi is menstruating, the principle of doing no work for villagers is understanding that Bhudevi needs rest, and you should not plowing your fields during this time. So another example of how Hinduism celebrates menstruation is exemplified in the ceremony known as Ritikula Samskara. So this is performed when young girls get their first period. So they're gifted with so many presents, and they're welcomed into womanhood. They're worshipped with Abhishek and Haldi. I myself had this ceremony happen, and my entire family participated. And I found that when I told my friends, a lot of the girls living in the West were really embarrassed that their parents did this for them, or they were embarrassed to tell anyone that they got their first period. And that's because a lot of the conduct and the norms in Western industrial society believes that menstruation should remain hidden. Like, don't talk about it, don't tell anyone about it. However, Hinduism directly contradicts this because it's celebrating this. So what's the purpose of the celebration, right? So the entire purpose of the Hritikula Samskara is to impart positive notions about menstruation to young women. These young girls are treated as special. They're given gifts. In fact, the girls are even perceived to be manifestations of the Supreme Goddess, and that's why they're worshipped with Aarti. So the young girl is made to feel confident with her feminine identity. And the purpose of inviting your whole family is so that the elder women in the family, like your aunt, your grandmother, your mother, can share knowledge to help you become well adjusted with the oncoming physical and emotional changes of puberty. So with that information in mind, let's take a look at this paradox again. So here we understood that women were highly regarded in Hindu society, right? That's not debated at all. However, there were notions that women were impure. So let's completely change the narrative. Women are not impure. They have temporary bodily ashocha, which is sometimes fully contradicted by taking the Mahaprasad of Kamyaka Devi. So this temporary bodily ashocha that gives them unique opportunities for self-care and spiritual growth.
Exactly. And as we mentioned, the a lot of the issue in this paradox comes from the word ashaucha itself, which we debunked already, because ashaucha is used only and only for the discarded menstrual blood. It is not used for the process of menstruation, which we saw both in the shastras and even culturally is very revered, and it is definitely not used to describe a woman who's menstruating. So I hope this clears up this paradox, and I hope that the next time that somebody accuses Hinduism of being misogynistic, especially in the context of menstruation, we can have a good answer to give. Um, because Hindu shastras are genuinely not in any way misogynistic at all. Every aspect of femininity is considered divine and is revered. So now let's look at some of the more contemporary contexts. And I found this article that was written about Kamakhya Devi. And if I can just read out this, this small line that I found in the article. It is believed that Mother Earth becomes unclean for 3 days. It is then believed that Mother Earth has retrieved her purity. Now, just see, this is such a terrible interpretation of what happens at the Kamakhya Devi temple. And, forget the lack of research, which is, very evident, but just it's a very negative perspective in the first place. But okay, forget the perspective, let's just look at the facts. If you are telling me that for 3 days of the year Kamakhya Devi, while she is menstruating, is impure, then why is her Mahaprasad her very own menstrual cloth? If menstruation was so impure, then she wouldn't be giving Mahaprasad, right? Devotees wouldn't be begging for that menstrual cloth, which devotees are. Like I said, there's a waiting list. And it's and this is the issue with a lot of these mainstream media narratives that have been perpetuated, which is why I said, the maybe urban youth needs to be educated even more urgently, because we are the ones who are bombarded with things like this. And if the author had just done a little bit of research and said, okay, why do you do this, or what happens at the end of those 3 days, then she would have known that Mahaprasad is menstrual cloth, and the reason that the doors are shut is because the Devi needs rest, and the devotees are respecting the Devi's right to privacy, her right to not interact with devotees even if they want to. So um, I think this is one of the most crucial aspects that we need to talk about also. Like, we should know everything about the Shastras, but we should also know what people are saying about our Shastras. And we should know, what the truth is and where to separate. Like, unfortunately, most of us don't speak Sanskrit or haven't had access to the original Vedas or Shastras. So we may not know exactly what our Shastras say, but a little research can go a long way in negating, so that an article like this, which is so blatantly uninformed, doesn't make the rounds on social media.
So now let's take a look at a couple testimonials we've received about menstruation and current practices. So the very first one says, my mother makes sure she's not getting her period before we plan a puja in our house. So this is an example of how menstruation should be treated as a period of rest. The shastras understand that women exert a lot of energy during the hosting and execution of a puja, as I'm sure those of you who have done this before know, and women might not be able to give 100% of their energy that they can normally give. So it's really important to change the narrative from, oh, I can't host a puja because I'm impure, to I can't host the puja right now because I am not able to give 100% because I need rest. The next testimonial we have is that my mom chants and prays more when she's on her period. So this is an example of how menstruation is a time of austerity. So during this time, because there is no housework, women have a lot more time to focus on themselves, which gives them the unique opportunity to focus on their spiritual growth. So if you don't chant or pray, okay, we're not able to control the annotation, so I would like to request if someone is
yeah, and if Ani can do just a new share and share the slide again.
Can you stop sharing and share it again?
Yeah, just stop sharing.
Share it again. Sorry, we're just having a minute because what happens usually is that annotations are not able, like the host can't really control the annotations. So please give us a minute while we figure this out, but I can just talk about it. So the second testimonial was that my mom chants and prays more on her period, right? So this is just an example of how menstruation is a time of austerity. So during this time, because there's no like housework for women to do, they can focus on their spiritual growth. However, in the 21st century, we see that the original rules in the Dharma Shastra, such as, women don't need to cook for themselves, those aren't fully practiced. So if you can't take this time as tapasya and do the extra chanting, that's okay. Like Brinda mentioned before, Hinduism doesn't have a very prohibitory view on recommendations and rules. God is not going to hate you if you don't follow these things. It's not, we don't have a...
Papa. This does not fall under the category of Papa or Vikarma, not following these rules.
So it's not a bad thing at all. So the third testimonial we have here is that my sisters wash their hair on the 4th day of their periods. This is just an example of like human nature. It's a period of self-purification. It's indicative of all your waste leaving your body. And if women want to fully cleanse themselves, that's just human nature for them. And the last and the most, certainly not the least, the most hotly debated is my aunt doesn't go to her temple when she's on her period. So this is an example of how people love to follow rules without understanding why. Temples are just institutions that propagate shastric values. The notion of taking rest is pivotal in the shastric value of menstruation. The idea that menstruating women should not come to the temple is non-different than the idea that you shouldn't wear shoes in the temple, you shouldn't eat meat in the temple, you shouldn't come to the temple unbathed. Therefore, out of respect to an institution, women don't go to temples during their cycle. Instead, they choose to worship at home because menstruation doesn't mean your connection with God is severed. In fact, if you remember, we looked at the rules from the Dharma Shastra, which recommended that you do pray and you do read scripture. A temple is just a third-party institution that has its own set of rules that we, as patrons of the temple, need to respect. So now let's take a look at a couple ideas in the news talking about menstruation.
So, recently this topic of menstrual leave has dominated the discourse of the third wave feminists, especially in the Western Hemisphere. And the central argument around this is that women, the time of menstruation is really difficult, and therefore women should have extra leave for menstruation itself. And I would just point them to any of our Hindu shastras, including the Dharma Sutras, and say that, Hinduism thought of that much before third wave feminists did. And maybe, it's like the original third wave feminist movement of getting women to take rest and giving women more comfort and more luxury than they have in day-to-day affairs. to compensate for the tapasya, that is the hardship of menstruation.
So here are two posters for ads for painkillers specific to period pain. So the one on the left is Midol and the one on the right is Mornidine. And both of these advertisements describe menstrual pain as something that's like a nuisance or wretched. So Midol is a way to relieve you from your menstrual distress. Simply juxtapose this with the Hindu view. Menstrual cramps and menstrual mood swings are okay. Women don't need to overcome these symptoms because menstruation is an organic and natural process. Hinduism views period pain as normal, and in fact, you don't need to be Superwoman and take a painkiller and do your regular work again. You are not inferior or less of a woman if you can't cook breakfast on the first day of your periods. It's okay. This is grossly opposed in the Shastras. They specifically say, let the woman rest. She does not need to cook for herself or others. And in fact, it says, if you are with a menstruating woman, you should provide her with food that is pleasing to her taste. Of course.
We have a question here. It says, so those who have the capacity, in the sense that if they don't have any physical discomfort, they can be a part physically of puja or other rituals. Yes, because there are no pujaris standing at the door of temples asking you, do you have your periods or are you on your menstrual cycle? So yes, you can. And as I have mentioned repeatedly, the consequences of not following these guidelines or rules are not negative in terms of karma or papa or anything like that. Okay, the consequences are only that a woman will not feel rested. That is the only thing that the shastras talk about. However, when it comes to, say, larger temples, be it Tirupati or Srinathji, whatever, they do not rules, but they have recommendations that menstruating women ideally should not enter the temple. Now, like I said, these are independent outside institutions that have been following certain traditions over generations, and out of respect for that institution, women may choose not to go in. But if they go in, nothing, no calamity is going to strike. Maybe
Exactly.
unintentionally, if there are women who don't know the rules, have possibly gone in a lot, and nobody has made a big deal out of it. That is one aspect. Another aspect about being fit enough to, if you want to do pujas in your home, like we said also already, that this has nothing to do with your home deities or your home worship or whatever your own sadhana it is that you do at home. In fact, it is recommended you increase that, because it's a great way for, it's a great opportunity for you, because if you are abiding by the shastric guidelines, then you have more time on your hands from not doing several other things. So you can in fact use that to increase the tapasya value of your menstrual cycle. So yes, Hindu shastras are very flexible, they are very practical, and they are also very sensitive. So they are not they're not to be feared in that sense.
Exactly. Everything
I
Brenda said
hope
is,
that answers the question, because a couple people asked that. So
yeah. So please understand that these are recommendations for you. Whatever you want to do in your personal life is under your purview. But again, like as patrons of a temple, like it's important to respect their views. In fact, if temples were so against menstruation, like Brenda mentioned, they would be asking you as you walked in, but they don't. In fact, all the bathrooms in Western temples literally talk about, please don't flush your sanitary products and such. They provide sanitary products. So the entire idea that, you're going to be cursed if you don't follow these rules is completely debunked. So coming back to the painkillers. So again, the Shastras understood that you are not less of a woman if you weren't able to perform these tasks. Of course, that doesn't mean that in the 21st century, you shouldn't take painkillers. That's not the narrative here. If you're experiencing extreme menstrual pain, it means that instead of saying that, oh, I can do this, just be aware that our Shastras were progressive and very accommodating to our needs, especially the needs of a woman.
Okay, now coming to a controversy that was stirred up very recently last year, and the context and the controversy was around the non-entry of women of a certain age into one particular Ayyappa Swami temple at Sabrimala. um, a lot has been said about this, a lot has been talked about this, and like it would take weeks honestly to get into the details, but let's discuss the issue of Sabrimala specifically in the context of menstruation, because in the actual legal case as well that was filed in the Supreme Court, these activists, so-called activists, they allege that women are not allowed in the in Ayyappa Swami Sabrimala temple because they menstruate, and menstruating women are not allowed. That's not true. So if you ask me what is the broadly, if you can go to the next slide, if you ask me what does Sabrimala have to do with menstruation, nothing. There is absolutely no connection. Sabrimala temple has nothing to do with menstruation. It has everything to do with the deity of the temple, Ayyappa Swami, being a Naishtika Brahmachari in that one temple. And one of the principles that a Naishtika Brahmachari follows or has to follow to maintain his Naishtika Brahmacharya is that he has to avoid contact with the opposite sex, especially of a certain age. And out of respect for his Naishtika Brahmacharya, women don't go in. So it has nothing to do with menstruation. If there was a 30-year-old female who's had a hysterectomy and therefore does not menstruate at all, she would still not go in, because she, it has nothing to do with menstruation. So, and in fact, there was this whole campaign started by Ayyappa Swami devotees, especially women devotees, who has made this ready to wait campaign, because for them it was almost non consequential, because this is one of hundreds of Ayyappa Swami temples, all of which they are allowed in. In fact, there are a couple of Ayyappa Swami temples where there are only women pujaris who are allowed. So this has nothing to do with the degradation of women in Hindu shastras, and it certainly has nothing to do with menstruation. And it is just to do with that the rules of one particular deity. And like I mentioned, since it is its own institution, so externally we can respect that, the tradition of that institution. And and if just because you can't go to that one temple for a few certain years in your life, you have access to literally hundreds of other Ayyappa Swami temples that you can go to. So your connection with Ayyappa Swami is not reduced. Your bhakti to him, devotion to him, not impacted at all. And now, of course, there is a lot to be said about this issue at several different levels. So we'll just stick to the menstruation aspects uh, for today. Um,
So at this point, we would like to conclude our day one, and we can open up the floor for any questions that you might have. We
So
addressed
just
a
to
couple of.
recap a little bit, everything that we discussed. So we started with saying with the word ashaucha and how ashaucha has been really misappropriated. So ashaucha again, and because I cannot stress this enough, ashaucha only refers to discarded menstrual blood, not the process of menstruation, and not women, and definitely not womankind. Okay. Next, we came to the three ways that Hinduism views menstruation. Number one was that it's a period of austerity or tapasya. Number two, that it was a period of purification, and we saw that all three Vyavaharik koshas, your Annamay, Pranamay, and Manomay koshas, got purified in different ways through menstruation. And the third way was menstruation as a time of rest. Then we saw how certain guidelines that the Shastras gave, and how those guidelines had sometimes been used in a good way in the case of maybe, say, a Rajaparba festival, but sometimes also in a negative way in the case of some of these really unfortunate chopadis that have been built. But more, but we know we should know what the philosophy behind these is, and maybe through education those negative aspects can be improved upon. So those were the general principles that we discussed. So if anyone has um, any questions about this, we can take them. Please add them to the chat box. Also, we'll continue this discussion tomorrow, and tomorrow we'll take a larger bird's eye view of the entire globe. So here we focus largely on just India and Hinduism, um, but tomorrow we will look at pretty much the entire world from a global perspective. So we'll look at other Indian faiths also, maybe Buddhism or Jainism, Sikhism, but also look at really ancient civilizations and and what their philosophy and culture was around menstruation, and how over several millennia that has changed to what it is today. So tomorrow will be a very interesting talk as well. So I hope to see all of you again at the same time. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, let's go through the chat box and see if. Oh, someone asked about the Indra story, didn't they?
Yes.
Yes.
So
So there's a story that appears in the Puranas that talks about how Indra unknowingly committed a major sin, and there was very little way for him to atone for his mistake. And in his lamentation, women were one of the groups of jivas that offered their services, and they said, "We'll take on the burden of your sin." And the story is interpreted that women's menstruation is to nullify the sin of Indra. It's actually not like that. It's a little bit it's almost the other way around. So it's not that women weren't menstruating before this happened, and that because Indradev committed a sin, they suddenly started menstruating. Women were always menstruating. But we talked about how when menstruation is tapasya, it helps women negate several vikarmas that they would have committed. So women basically got together, and out of love and compassion to Indradev, they basically said that we get menstruation anyway, and we have a facility for us to get rid of that vikarma. You don't have that facility, so let us take on that vikarma for you, and through our menstruation help you recover from that sin. So that is the general story. Um, I hope that answers the question.
so a
Uh,
lot of questions I'm getting here are we can we chant, can we pray? Of course, it's recommended that you do
in
these
fact,
things.
pray more, chant more. Like that's what the shastras themselves recommend. They said you should have access to dharmic books and dharmic scriptures, and you should be reading them. And you should be studying them during menstruation specifically, because like I said, you have more time on your hands. You're getting rid of a lot of impurities, so it's a better time to access knowledge as well. So definitely.
I'd also like to say that we are talking about a very broad Shastric Sanatan Dharma view. So if you follow a certain type, a certain line, I would recommend that you talk to your teachers about it and ask them to explain why these customs are there to begin with. Shastrically, this is what is there. We're presenting what the facts are. So if your interpretation of that, if your family's interpretation of that is a little different, instead of blindly accepting that this is what it is, I would implore you to question. Questioning is really important, and questioning is critical in Sanatan Dharma.
So
So yeah.
there's a question, there's an excellent point made about a shaucha is even a man who has had an injury on any part of his body that has bled, until the time that the clot is still prominent, he is considered to have a shaucha. So like
Exactly.
that is, I did not know this, so thank you for informing us. But that is very consistent with the shastric view, because like I said, shastra deals with even urine and feces and sweat as a shaucha. So naturally not everyone, because that would mean literally every single human on planet earth is an impure individual. So
Exactly.
that's not the goal of that's not what a shaucha means, and that's not what the shastras say. um, and somebody asks, elders ask us to purify the entire house with turmeric water after the fifth day. Why? So this is heavily dependent on your own local tradition and culture, and local traditions and culture really impact how shastras are implemented, not just for menstruation, for everything. In fact, that is the way shastras have been designed, that the shastras will give you principle, but the implementation or the details of the principles is based on your specific context. And so it is very common to have differing rituals and differing traditions, but the principle or the goal remains the same. Now, so
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what the tradition or history is associated with um, the turmeric water, but we all know that turmeric is a powerful antiseptic, and it has several other healing properties. It helps you with rejuvenation as well. So maybe it has something to do with the medicinal properties of turmeric, and helping the woman come back to full energy. And if maybe it's that, but I'm not entirely like.
Your customs are, unique to your traditions, so you
Yeah,
should.
yeah, it's very dependent on your own local tradition, and your where you're from. All of that plays a huge part.
Right. So tomorrow we will be discussing other faiths, and we hope today was informative for you and today was interesting. And I got a lot of questions about if men are allowed to listen to this. Of course, like I would hope that men are listening to this too, because a
Yeah.
lot of the times what happens is false narratives are are only false narratives because a few people are creating the narrative. So the more people we can educate, and like Brenda mentioned, the more urban people who are educated, we can help society in the long run.
Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. There are a few other questions here. So, can you elaborate on how the physical process and mental process of cleanliness during this period are connected? Or can you share some resources? So we will share some resources, and especially like the references that we looked at, we can share them with you at the end of tomorrow's session. But in terms of how the physical and mental processes are connected, I think Gayatri had touched upon this point a little bit, that how all of your five koshas are interconnected and interlinked. So it is not that these koshas operate individually. So what is happening in your Annamaya kosh will affect your Pranamaya kosh, and that is just a logical thing as well, right? Like you can't tell me that if you've been stabbed in the leg, then your mind is going to be very stable, or your intellect is going to be as sharp as it normally is. So they are very interconnected. So usually, so when cleanliness is happening on, or purification, the way we talked about it, is happening on the bodily level, usually there are some prana qualities associated with that as well. So there are prana qualities associated with the menstrual blood also, and there are some and which are gotten rid of, like we mentioned. And also the process itself helps with a person's mental state in terms of the manomay kosh. So all five koshas are interlinked, specifically these three vyavaharik koshas that we talked about, the anamay, pranmay, and manomay koshas. So I hopefully that answers your question as well. And there are several other questions about like specific rituals or specific practices. Like there were questions about cooking prasad, and offering prasad to deities, worshipping Tulsi
We
Marani,
can answer
all
tomorrow.
of that. Yeah, and we can, and again, our answer is going to be the same for all of these, that the shastras don't forbid anything as such. If there are your own specific traditional practices that you want to follow, you are free to follow them or not follow them as per your convenience. And especially if these practices exist within the confine of your home, then you are king and lawmaker in one, so it's entirely up to you.
Exactly. Yeah. As far as the bibliography goes, tomorrow at the end of the session, I'll put up all of our sources. But our sources are just the Dharma Shastra, Dharma Sutra, Vasishtha Dharma Sutra, Agni Smriti, everything like that.
Thank you all so much for joining us. And I hope to see everyone tomorrow again, like I said, at the same time. And tomorrow we'll look at the entire world in general, and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, as it were. So thank you all very much for joining, and I hope to see you tomorrow.
And please invite your male friends. I want them to understand and listen.
Yes.
Thank you.
Tomorrow we'll also look at the more cultural history and cultural evolution and aspects of menstruation as well.
Bye.